Hi there, this is Liz Pierce at Linn-Benton Community College in Albany, Oregon, and this screencast is being made for my Contemporary Families in the United States class in May 2020. This is the class that was to be a face-to-face class and was moved online at the last minute due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This screencast is about the big ideas related to the family, state, and social policy. So I'm going to try to concentrate on the policies that affect the needs and well-being of families and really just the macro trends, the highlights, looking back to starting with around the 1930s, which is when the United States became what's called a welfare state. Now that doesn't mean individual states. Welfare state is referring to the whole United States. And this was to protect families from what we call the harshness of capitalism. And that's where some of the really big laws that we just really take for granted today were started. So the Social Security Act, minimum wage, aid to families with dependent children, this also included unemployment. Really important thing to note though, certain groups of people were excluded. Primarily domestic and agricultural workers, and these groups are very largely populated by people of color, immigrants, minoritized groups. So they were excluded from these big acts that were meant to protect people with help from the government. This followed the Great Depression. And it also reinforced what's called the family wage system, which means a wage basically enough to support a family with one wage. That's quite different from the minimum wage, which is not intended to be a family wage. And this graph over here shows the federal minimum wage in real 2020 dollars. And what's important to see in this graph is that while the wage has gone up in amount from about $1 to about $7, when we look at it in terms of real money, real 2020 dollars, it really has barely increased from about $5.50 to about $7. So the next period of time, like I said, I'm just kind of highlighting and focusing on major trends as I want to talk about the 1960s and the 1970s. There was a lot of social change and economic change. And one of the important things to remember is that social change and economic change often happen together. So following World War II that took us out of that Great Depression, there was a lot of prosperity. And there was the big baby boom, which is our largest generation to date in America. But there was still a lot of poverty, and that poverty was disproportionately Black minorities, children, and the elderly. And that's going to lead to some of the social change that's coming on. But at the same time, we still had a lot of economic growth. The space race, so a lot of money going into space and economics. As that decade progresses, though, the family wage system is starting to weaken. And part of that is related to some of the social movements that are also occurring. So we're seeing a civil rights movement, we're seeing a women's movement, and also the sexual revolution. So a lot of opening and awareness and discussion and activism around rights and equity. This led to a big movement called the War on Poverty. This was one of our first times we had war on something. And basically, I mentioned on the previous slide about some groups being more likely to experience poverty. So this is where we saw like the start of Head Start, which was meant to help preschool children that were poor to kind of do as well in school as other children. And also there was a focus on helping the elderly and the elderly poor. So we saw the addition of Medicare and Medicaid. By the way, we've been more successful in eradicating poverty for the elderly than we have with children, and we've talked about that in another screencast. Other things that happened in the 1960s, there's a lot. Not all of it is on here, but the big Civil Rights Act, which was about prohibiting discrimination based on certain characteristics. And that included the Fair Housing Act, which you're reading a lot about, the Voting Rights Act, and Immigration and Nationality Act, which kind of opened up immigration, especially to Asian countries. The Housing Act deserves special mention because owning a home in America is what was considered the American dream, and this is sort of the most basic way that families can accrue investment and accrue wealth. You're reading at length about that in Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations, and also in the housing chapter of your text. So I'm not going to go over this slide, but it is here for your reference. Moving into the 1970s, economic boom is continuing up into about the mid-70s, and then we start to see what's called stagflation, which is basically our economy didn't start going down too much, but it kind of stayed the same. And there's a lot of tie-in with sort of oil and gas shortages and changes in the import and export systems. So we had this economic lack of growth, basically, but also inflation. So inflation continuing to go up, so prices going up, but our economic system staying steady. So that's what basically stagflation is. And by the way, I really did experience what you see in this car, people lining up for gas, and only being able to get gas on certain days of the week based on whether your license plate was odd or even. So quite different than what we're experiencing today during the COVID pandemic and having a glut of oil and gas. But right now, moving into the 80s and 90s, we saw some of that, those social movements. So now we are seeing changes in families, a more broader definition of family and relationships. And it's really important to note that these social movements and who we are as people and individuals who impact those does impact policy. And policy impacts us. So, summarized there, increase in non-marital childbearing, increase in single-parent families, more parents working outside the home. Remember, I mentioned about the family wage system becoming destabilized. We have fewer of those family wage jobs, so that leads to more people needing to work outside the home. Fertility rates declining, so fewer babies being born, mortality also decreasing, so then we have more older people. So you can see how the generations are changing, increase in the older population, decrease in the younger population. Then we see policies related. So for example, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was a military policy which sort of loosened the ability for people who identified as lesbian, bi, or gay to serve in the military, but it prohibited them from disclosing that they were gay or talking about it. So we see changes in policy that don't totally free up and create true equity, but are somehow attempting to move toward more equity. We also see changes in programs from being entitlements. So for example, the aid to families to dependent children, which had existed since the 1930s, and every person who qualified would get that. We saw that change now to being more restricted and making it having more requirements related to it, but also turning it into a block program, which means it's a set amount of money, and when it's gone, as opposed to an entitlement where everybody who qualifies gets that money. So again, I want to emphasize there's explicit policy and there's implicit policy when we talk about the government. And so explicit, you just might think those are things that are more obvious and that the country tends to acknowledge more as aid or assistance. So again, what we call welfare or temporary aid to needy families, food stamps, Medicaid are all examples of that explicit. Implicit would be things like tax deductions for mortgage interest payments. So example, if you own a home versus if you rent, you get a favorable tax status because you are getting to deduct some of that interest payment from your taxes. tax policies that incentivize marriage. And my question to you is, where would you put student financial aid? Do you see that as a implicit policy, explicit policy? Is it government assistance? To close, I just want to talk about the current, what are, from sort of 2000 to 2020 and beyond. And it's always a little harder to analyze what is most recent because we don't know what will really affect us most over time. But here are some things that I think if we were in class, you might brainstorm with me. So first of all, 9/11 was probably, until this pandemic, perhaps the biggest event in the lives of those of you that are young, traditionally aged college students. We had a war start. We have a much bigger debate about privacy versus security. We saw a lot of bias, a lot of division, especially towards people who are Muslim or from countries that are predominantly Muslim. And we've seen a dramatic change in immigration policy and immigration law, especially from about 2016. Deadly shootings and other mass shootings, and this affects all families, of course, but I want to draw special attention to the increase in shootings, mass shootings that occur in schools and in places of worship. These are places that many children see as safe places, and to now see that those are some of the deadliest places to be in the United States is something that is probably going to impact our children in ways that we don't yet understand. The Black Lives Matter social movement. So again, more attention to equity, paying attention to how actions are affecting one group disproportionately, and people who are Black, specifically not so much in the mass shootings, but more being shot or killed by citizens or by arms of the government, disproportionately killed, shot when people who are not of color would not likely be shot, would not likely be killed. We've had some government shutdowns, and probably then the next biggest event is the Great Recession of 2007-8 that lasted into about 2013, 14, 15. Oregon was actually one of the last states to recover from the recession, so for us it was longer. So this is probably the other key event that has affected so many of us. All of us know people who lost jobs. Many people lost homes. Big housing crisis. So this is probably one of the biggest effects on us as families in this era. The Affordable Care Act increased health insurance for families in this country, so very significant social act. It was not an entitlement or even a block program like some of our previous social welfare acts, but it did increase Americans' access to health care. And another key thing it did was create what's called mental health parity, meaning that insurance companies could no longer distinguish and say that mental health care had to be limited more than physical health care. So this is really key to many of us and to healthy families, to being able to get mental health care. We've seen changes in same-sex marriage, tax reform in 2017 that is temporary relief for families that will sunset and will have to be re-upped if we're going to keep those tax reform reductions. The DREAM Act is a really significant piece of legislation that has not passed but remains very alive in terms of our ideas in this country and our conversation around immigration and families who are and DACA as well, so Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival. So this is affecting families living right here who have lived and worked here for many, many, many years. And when your status is unclear, this creates all kinds of kind of spiraling other effects on families' well-being. We have the proposed border wall. There was government shutdown. I mentioned that already. Pretty dramatic increase in detention of immigrants from 2017 to 2019, including 5 times as many children. When we think about effects effects on immigrant families, we're thinking about those as families who live in the United States. And if you could imagine your child being detained in a prison or cell or prison-like setting, perhaps separate from their parents, this is going to have mental health and physical health effects on children. That's going to affect all of us who live in this country. And the last thing, as I'm recording this, as I said, in May 2020, we don't know by any means at all what the effects of the pandemic are going to be on us. Right now, economists are predicting that the economic effects will last into the mid-2020s, and that even though our unemployment right now is the worst it's been since the Great Depression, since 1939, that it's not going to last as long as the recession did. So they think it won't be quite, it may have gotten worse, but it won't last as long. A big question is, because we link health insurance to employment in this country and unemployment has been so bad, will that change how we view health insurance in this country? Birth rates have been declining. The prediction is they will continue to decline during COVID. Will more people get married? Will more people get divorced? Usually there's less during a recession. A lot of interesting hypotheses about how romantic and partner relationships may change. That because early on in relationships people aren't physically together but must maintain and communicate about more intimate matters, more difficult matters, this may change romantic and partner relationships. Jobs and employment, especially related to anything that brings large groups of people together, the arts, education, sports, of course, those are going to look dramatically different. So we're going to see lots of change. I could probably, even if I recorded this screencast in 1 week, this would look different. So as you listen to it now, think about what are the effects of the pandemics you've seen on your own family and also on families in a more related to your sociological imagination. What are the big trends and effects on families? Take care.